Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the ANU China Seminar Series. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and give respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. So today is a sort of red letter day for us because Sophie's an old friend, a wonderful scholar, a Canberra person of sorts. And we've been trying to get Sophie here, and for various life reasons, it hasn't happened. But finally today, it has happened, and we're all extremely pleased that Sophie can give a seminar for us today. I should actually be rather more formal and say Dr. Loy-Wilson has been, etc., etc. But there we go. So Dr. Loy-Wilson is a senior lecturer at the University of Sydney in the History Department, where she did her honours degree and her PhD, although some of her undergraduate years were spent in this institution. She's the author of the very wonderful Australians in Shanghai, Race, Rights and Nation in Treaty-Port China. It came out in 2017 and which was translated into Chinese, which is, you know, that's a fairly notable thing to happen. Only 2 years later, it was published in China. She's also published I'm not quite sure how to describe this. It's a book that takes previously done oral histories and makes them available for a reading public. And those oral histories were from Australian Chinese people done in the 80s and 90s. Yeah. Called South Flows the Pearl, which is a lovely title. And she's also co-editor with Diane Kirkby of Labour History and the quote-unquote Cooley Question, which is, again, superb work. So it's really great to have Sophie here. Lovely audience here. There's also a large audience online. So we'll do questions and answers at the end, but the way we'll do this, the way we've learned to do this, is that I will take questions here, alternately with questions online. Questions asked in this room, I will repeat because the people online can hear me through here, but they probably can't hear you when you're speaking from the room. And people online, I'm addressing you now, if you could write your questions in the chat function on Zoom, then I will take them and read them to Dr. Loy-Wilson. It'll become clearer towards the end. So a big welcome. Thank you so much for coming. Looking forward to it greatly.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much to the China and the World Centre for having me today. I've always been a huge fan of this centre, so it's really quite special for me to be here. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on Ngunnawal Ngambri country, and I want to pay my respects to the elders of this unceded land. In Sydney, I live and work on the land of the Gadigal and Wongal people, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders of that country as well. So I spend much of my time these days with legal records, with court records. So I sit with European, Chinese, Indigenous Australian ideas of justice and injustice. And there are many contraventions on this blood-soaked Australian soil. And this has got me thinking a lot about the legal infrastructure of this country and the kinds of concepts of justice that underpin it, that we aspire to and fail to meet so much of the time. And so I'm thinking a lot about the voice to Parliament and about ratifying the Uluru Statement of the Heart, which I believe must be written into law. So I want to start here in this abandoned gold mining town of Buckland in Victoria. It was once a bustling town, now abandoned. And I pulled up in this town in January 2022 on a sunny afternoon. I dragged my kids there, often drag my kids to random cemeteries in Australia. They love it. It's so much fun, no complaints at all. So this is Buckland's old Chinese cemetery. And it's one of the sites of the Buckland anti-Chinese massacre of 1857. There was once a whole kind of forest of gravestones on this site, but they were illegally removed in the 1970s by local farmers. But the bodies are still beneath the ground. The 1970s were, ironically, a very vital moment for the discovery of Australian national history, when the convict past in this country was sort of claimed and celebrated for the first time, and a notion of a kind of unique Australian national character linked partly to that past, the so-called new nationalism, was becoming orthodoxy under the Whitlam government. So right when Australians were coming to terms with one aspect of their past, in Buckland, another side of this story was being removed, forgotten. Except it could never be quite expunged. In recent years, a team of La Trobe University archaeologists have surveyed this site in Buckland using electromagnetic induction to find the bodies beneath the ground. Chinese Australian community groups have subsequently put up their own headstones honouring the dead. Meanwhile, in Sydney, in the 1980s and 90s, another set of headstones was going up. These were memorials in Rookwood's Chinese section in Sydney, and they were built for the first generation of Chinese Australians to really put their story on the historical record. That is the generation that was born at the turn of the century. So Chinese Australians that lived through two revolutions, 1911 and 1949, Japanese invasion, Civil War, Cold War, the end of white Australia, reform and opening in China under Deng Xiaoping, so this generation. By the 1980s, they were telling their stories to historians through oral histories. And Li Seng, who you see on the right here, his headstone, he was one such person who told his story. Li came from a village in South China in Guangdong in the Lungdu district of Zhongshan, the district that sent a lot of people to Sydney. He was the third generation in his family to come to Australia. Li Seng's grandfather, father, and uncles came to Queensland before him. He died in 1989, the year a whole new generation of Chinese migrants, the Tiananmen generation, will depart China for Australia. So there are three photographs on this headstone. Li's photo has been placed next to his two wives. His second wife, Lam Tin-Yup, was born in the year of the 1911 Chinese Revolution, the year the Qing dynasty was overthrown, and she died in 1986. His first wife, Xiu Yimhe, was born during China's 100-day reforms in 1898 and died in 1930. She died in a village in South China the year after the Wall Street crash and a year before the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, far from Rookwood, far from Sydney, far from Australia. She died so young, so long ago, but presumably on Li Seng's instructions, his family included her photograph on the headstone, despite the absence of the body. So here we have two cemeteries, missing headstones, new headstones, lives that cross two empires, two nations. How do we tell this story? So I work on Chinese Australian history. This is a sort of a field with an inherent tension at its heart, right? Or it's a story that's claimed by two very different histories, two very different national traditions. On the one hand, we have the history of the overseas Chinese, of Chinese diasporas, if you like, the global circulation of Chinese peoples from China proper, beginning in the 16th century, what Stephen Miles calls one of the most important developments of the past 5 centuries. And on the other hand, we have the national histories that claim these communities. So Chinese Indonesian history, Chinese American history, Chinese Canadian history, Chinese Australian history. In Australia, we associate these Chinese migrations with the gold rushes and with, more darkly, the rise of the xenophobic Australian nationalism culminating in the White Australia policy of 1901. So these are two very different ways of seeing the same phenomenon. One's a global story with China at its centre. The other's far more local, with Australian identity at its core. Both use the overseas Chinese, I would argue, to illuminate aspects of their own nationalism and assert aspects of that nationalism, its promises, its perils, its limits. But where are Chinese Australians in Australian history? And why does it matter? So, I spend my time lately in Australia's vast court archives. One of the institutions that we know the British Empire held very dear, while also using selectively and sometimes corruptly, was the rule of law. Across the Australian colonies, courts churned through cases. Circuit courts travelled to remote locations. In Queensland, scribes were so desperate for ink, they cut it with dirty water and worse. And you can still smell it on the paper today, actually, in Queensland. One of the colonial communities that used the court system most frequently was the Chinese migrant community. In fact, Henry Reynolds, when he was writing his book about Capricornia, the great Indigenous historian Henry Reynolds, he said the Chinese migrants were the most litigious community in the Australian colonies, and that their use of the lower courts, mostly against each other, by the way, remains largely unknown, a story yet to be told, although recent work has made excellent inroads. In fact, Benjamin Penny's written some great work on court records, and Mark Finane as well. So for my DECRA, I've read cases from Carnarvon in WA, from Bendigo in Victoria, from Charters Towers in Queensland. And these cases are often full of Chinese language material. The minutes of native place societies, remittance letters, calendars, even rough political manifestos or love letters. And I've used these cases to kind of plot a picture of Chinese Australia, okay, kind of a rough one. This is some of the work that I'm doing for my DECRA, you can see here. These archives lay bare the inner workings of Chinese Australian communities, what I like to call a kind of ghost economy that operates slightly outside, I think, the settler colonial state. Business partnerships gone wrong, labour disputes between workers and merchants, missing remittance payments, lots of those, gambling debts, lots of those, intergenerational conflict over land transfer and inheritance, the breakdown of friendships, marriages, sexual relationships. Court cases centering on debt reveal how debt obligations impacted the relatives of Chinese Australians in South China who felt this acutely. Probate documents call for inheritance to be distributed to Chinese wives and children. So as I read through these cases, I was struck by the ubiquity of Chinese migrants across the Australian colonial world. It's very common for Chinese Australian historians, I'd add this is the case in other countries as well, and amongst Chinese American historians, for example, to justify their field by the use of demography. So there were this many Chinese migrants that arrived, there were this percentage of the population. I don't think that's a very helpful way of thinking about Chinese migrants in this country, because what I've seen is that Chinese migrants were central to the story of Australian settler colonialism and pastoral expansion. So it's not about numbers, it's about ubiquity. I've read hundreds and hundreds of cases now from 1860 to 1940. And Chinese Australians were in most towns, in most industries, integrated into so many communities in complex ways, weaving deep social ties. And yet, arguably, I think Chinese Australians are still largely absent from our historical consciousness in this country, from history making in this country, from our grand national histories. If we follow in the footsteps of Indigenous and environmental historians, and we imagine the Australian environment as a kind of archive of the frontier, then it's really impossible to ignore the legacies of the Chinese presence written literally onto the land. On Christmas Island, Chinese miners died in droves of malnutrition. Their graves dot the island to this day, buried amongst its white coral foundations. In the Riverina in New South Wales and in the Shoalhaven districts, workers cleared land, they burnt scrub, ringbark trees. Eric Rolls tells us that Chinese ringbarkers and wood clearers used massive 7.5-pound axes, these kind of huge axes, which they cleared the bush with. Aboriginal elders, so Yuin elders in the Shoalhaven districts where this picture is taken, remember the haunts of Chinese abalone fishermen. And as you can see here, near Manning Clark's property in Lake Wapango in the South Coast, there's an old Chinese market garden, and Manning Clark's granddaughter, Anna Clark, is convinced that these Caradom trees here, who aren't native to the area, she thinks they were planted by Indigenous women who used the Caradom bark as fishing, to make fishing twine. And she thinks they negotiated with the Chinese market gardens to keep those trees on that land. At Sydney's quarantine station, Chinese sailors wrote directly onto the sandstone itself. Stories of protest against tyrannical governments, both Chinese and European, stories of pain and dislocation, stories of defiance. Down with this type of man, reads one inscription above a satirical rendering of an Englishman in a kind of elaborate necktie. You see this here, right? Along with the Indigenous rock art of First Contact, which also depicted Europeans in their strange dress, these sandstone archives remind us that European power in this land was always challenged, was never total. Chinese quarantine rock carvings have been translated in recent years, part of a corpus of Chinese language sources now audible amongst the largely English language archives, which still anchor the Australian sense of the past. And here's another example of a recently translated archive. I think that when we start to consult these sources, like really listen to Chinese language sources, both the ones written in sandstone and the more orthodox textual records, when we really listen, the true cost of upholding a Eurocentric vision of Australia's past is revealed. For the alternative histories they proffer free us to see Australia, I think, in new, less Western-centred ways. They invite us into a world, in Samia Kutun's words, in which the suffocating monolingualism of Australian history is rolled back to reveal the multi-ethnic heart of the Australian continent. This really is Australian history in a Chinese context. And it's no small thing. In fact, it's quite a radical way, I think, of looking at history, especially Australian history. Up here we have the play The Poison of Polygamy, which is on right now in Sydney, which, as some of you might know, is based on Australia's first Chinese language novel, which was a kind of moralistic text, serialized in the Chinese press in the late 19th century, very critical through a Christian lens of polygamy in Chinese communities, hence The Poison of Polygamy. And it's actually being shown right now. When I was trained as a historian in the 2000s, there was a real push to start acknowledging the contribution of Chinese migrants to Australia's past. And this push happened in tandem with calls for greater understanding of Australia's Indigenous past. But I think that the way we view our history in this country, the way we view our mainstream history, still has a kind of stubborn, recalcitrant, fossilized dependency on a European way of viewing the past. How do we dislodge this? How do we change what is written or not written in Australian history textbooks? How to take Chinese Australian history and place it at the heart of what it means to be Australian? So I've found a profound mismatch between the archives I've been looking at, the legal environmental archives I've been looking at, and the way that Australian history is written. So the stories I'm finding in the archives are mostly absent from mainstream Australian history texts. So Chinese Australian history as a field, it's quite old now. I get reminded a lot by my colleagues. It's 40 years old, a lot's been done. And these are some of the key texts up here, kind of canonical texts in my field that are kind of very influential. But I think, and I haven't been challenged on this, that Chinese Australian history still remains quarantined from mainstream Australian history making. It's a common refrain amongst Chinese Australian historians that the field is overlooked by mainstream Australian history. So Jan Ryan famously said in 1997, the Chinese are simply not there in our grand national histories. Where are Chinese migrants in the history books of Australia? So Chinese Australian history may not feature prominently in debates over the past, but arguably China has always been at the centre of debates over the nation's future and still is. So witness the plethora of books released in recent years on so-called Sino-Australian relations, more than 5 in 2021 alone. These texts are part of a long tradition in Australian political discourse which places China more as proxy than as territory, a site for the playing out of domestic Australian debates and anxieties over security, left-right politics, and geopolitical power shifts, rather than the historic source of one of the country's largest populations of non-white migrants. So I'm a fan of a lot of these books that are reviewed in this article here, but if you read them, you'll see they don't dedicate much space to Australia's Chinese past. Maybe they shouldn't, but it's very clear when you read these that the colonial past is just absent from the discussion. There's a stark disciplinary separation between China analysts on the one hand and Chinese Australian historians on the other. This forgetfulness bleeds into media coverage as well. I'm a great fan of Benjamin Law. I spoke on his show. You know, I'm not here to criticize, I love Benjamin Law. But on the eve of the launch of his documentary, which I was part of, tracing his family's Chinese Australian history, Waltzing the Dragon, Benjamin Law was criticised by historians when he wrote that Australia's Chinese Australian history was largely untold. He said, and the thing is, it's not that Australians don't care about these stories or have no interest. That's what he said. It's just that the stories haven't been told. Imagine the response from my colleagues. So the idea that Australians were only now stumbling upon a kind of forgotten Chinese past seemed to many in the field to erase decades of scholarly labour. And yet Benjamin Law was far from alone in his belief that Australia's Chinese history is forever being uncovered for the first time, a kind of perpetual newness, which I think reveals much about the isolation of this history from Australian historical consciousness. So hidden histories and forgotten histories remain kind of favoured descriptors in the scholarship. Now, this turn away from the past in Sino-Australian analysis, I think has a ripple effect beyond immediate debate. It has allowed Australians to avoid confronting our long history of anti-Chinese violence, and it has elided hard questions about the multi-ethnic foundations of Australian settler history, including the complicity of Chinese migrants in the systematic settler violence perpetrated against Indigenous Australians. One of the phenomena that I've observed in recent years is a large number of Chinese Australian descendants writing their own histories via PhDs or via their own self-published works. One of these descendants is the rather wonderful Natalie Fong, who's a historian up in Queensland. And she wrote a famous PhD that won many awards about her family's the famous merchant family that she was a part of. And her merchant family were absolutely central to the colonization of the area around Darwin. And what she found in her research was that her ancestors were entirely complicit in reprisal violence against Indigenous Australians in Darwin. And so she's one of the first descendants to come out and say, we were complicit in this violence. I've got proof here. Another Chinese Australian descendant, Juanita Kwok, has also noted forms of anti-Chinese violence not yet publicly acknowledged or thought about. So she's gone through court records and she speculated that quite a lot of the violence that she read about may not be as innocent as it first seems. So she's looked at a number of suicides, for example, in the Spala district, and she speculated that these might have actually been foul play. So what I'm trying to say here is that contradictory forces are at play, I think, in this moment, because just as Chinese Australian descendants are reclaiming the China within through the discovery of Chinese ancestry, family documents, the translation of Chinese language documents, and private archives. So just as this kind of China within is being discovered, Sino-Australian relations themselves are under strain, and Australian leaders are distancing themselves from the Chinese state. It's kind of a contradictory moment we're in at the moment. Underlying all of this is the fact that we're all painfully aware of that expertise on Asia in this country has long been underfunded, long been eroding. So sources are becoming available, mushrooming, out of the ground from these families, but our capacity to analyze and contextualize this material is diminishing. So now we're going to get to kind of the second part of my talk. So why has Chinese Australian scholarship remained quarantined from Australian history writing? Why does this matter? So here I want to posit two answers. Both are anchored deep in the foundations of Australian history writing, or recall the early voices of Australian nationalist historians as they argued passionately for unique Australian history outside the confines of European empires and their chroniclers. If we are to understand the resistance in Australian society to Chinese, indeed Asian, visions of the Australian past, we must unravel the history of Australian history, and especially the political contexts within which some of Australia's most famous historians practice their craft. So now we can get to our friends here. You might recognize them. So I think the first reason for a resistance to Chinese perspectives amongst mainstream Australian historians is fundamentally the Cold War context within which a potent strand of Australian national history took shape. Australian national history in the post-war period was written as a response to Cold War polemics, and especially the accusation levelled against all these men that left-leaning Australian historians were enthralled to communist powers. So all these three historians here, Brian Fitzpatrick over here, Russell Ward here, and Manning Clark here, all men that had a lot to do with the halls of the Australian National University. All of these men at different times found their lives severely affected by the ugly ideological polemics of the Cold War. In fact, Russell Ward, he very much, reflected that his own marriage and life in this time suffered severely because of the perception of surveillance during the Cold War. So what do I mean by the Cold War? Well, I mean two things. I mean the actual historical time period, the so-called First Cold War, which by some reckoning begins in 1947 and ends in 1971. But I think more importantly, I mean the Cold War sensibilities, which led the Australian government to question the loyalties of Chinese Australians, such as the men in this picture. This is the Chinese Youth League, which is sort of a communist organisation in Sydney in the Cold War, began in the 40s. So I mean the Cold War sensibilities that led the Australian government to question the loyalties of Chinese Australians, to worry that they were spies, potential spies for communist China, to conduct intense surveillance on their workplaces and activities, to threaten them with deportation or imprisonment. This is a kind of, a segment of a security file on the Chinese Youth League, and you can see at the bottom here, Fred Wong is mentioned. So I've had quite a lot to do with his family in the past year, his son especially, and his son gave me this document. And you can see here that Fred's described as one of the most active Chinese communists in Sydney at the time. The memories of the Cold War, the threats of deportation, the surveillance are still very strong in Chinese Australian communities. They kind of hang over, they shadow all the conversations I've had in the past year, actually, the memory of the Cold War, because so many Chinese Australian families feared deportation at this time under Cold War. So when I speak about the Cold War, I speak about its personal impacts and legacies as well on Chinese Australian communities. So this is the period in which some of the classic texts of Australian national history are written. Now, these texts were not about the Cold War. They were about the frontier. But I want to suggest that we need to not just attend to the frontier when we look at these texts. We need to think about the conversation with the times the historians were having as well. So these national histories were born in the era of decolonisation, when Australian historians were de-imperialising Australia's past and seeking a nativist birthright for Australian working people free from British influence, mining the past to reveal the national character, in Mark McKenna's words. So the radical position of this time was to be anti-British, anti-imperial, and to foster an independent Australian national belief, shorn of what Russell Ward called our, quote, habit of subservience, unquote. So in these really polarised times, these historians are committing to a great idea, a great mythology. And Australian historians found this mythology in the bush, in convict ancestors, in the pastoral worker, in bush songs and stories of the frontier. Like the American Wild West, Australia's colonies were being civilised in print, redeeming the fallen, usually convicts and bushrangers, and returning them to respectable society. This is the 60s and 70s. So because history was concerned with furthering Australian national exceptionalism in the Cold War and later, and Chinese communities didn't quite fit into the logic of this bush ethos, their history was all but silenced. Arguably, I think these Cold War histories of the frontier continue to suffuse our political culture, particularly our labour culture, in subterranean ways. This is because Australian history writing and political life fused in these decades. History was pushed to the centre stage, politicised as never before, in Mark McKenna's words. Historians such as Russell Ward and Jeff Blaney were active in this period, producing between them classic texts in the Australian historical canon, laying the tectonic plates of a neo-national Australian mythology. Ward's The Australian Legend remains a cultural touchstone for Australian nationalism, while Blaney's Tyranny of Distance has been in print since 1967. Chinese Australians are all but absent from these studies, despite mounting evidence at the time of the pervasive nature of Chinese settlement from 1850. Few Australian history books have reached such a wide and popular audience, wrote Drew Cottle of The Australian Legend. He also noted that Russell Ward wrote, quote, against the racism of Cold War Australia, but he implicitly endorsed assimilation by excluding Chinese Australians from the pantheon of Australianness. Arguably, this separation between Anglo and Asian experiences in conceptions of our past has been an enduring one. So I think for these national historians, China was a symbol of an alternative political and economic system rather than a place. So it didn't animate their histories as a place. I think this kind of explains or goes some way to explaining the notable absence of Chinese Australians in this moment. I think that anti-communism constrained the ability of these historians to see the China within, leading them to focus on China through the lens of economic and political theory at the expense of a historical memory inclusive of Chinese Australians. Okay. All right. So I think the second reason why Chinese Australians have been largely absent from our national consciousness is the Eurocentric preoccupations which have defined periodization in Australian history. So the West's importance to the Australian path, which orders historical time in this country. So I think that events in Asia tend to fade into the background because English language sources have taken the narrative lead in how we tell our history. So this is what Donald Horne said. Donald Horne said, many Australians think a great deal more about Russia, Eastern Europe, and West Berlin than they do about China or South Vietnam. Their training tells them to do so. This is the kind of area in their textbooks where most history happens. So what Anna Clark calls the disciplinary architecture of Australian history has been built in such a way as to overstate the importance of the West. Asian chronologies, empires, revolutions, wars, wash up on the walls of a supposedly isolated Australia, while events in Europe, I think, are allowed seismic aftershocks. You can see here. So what this actually says is that this family is was threatened with deportation quite regularly in the 40s and 60s. It's the Lee family from Cairns, who I spoke to last year. So Zora Simic and Ruth Ballant have argued that non-European migrants hover at the margins of our histories, partly because immigration history in Australia rarely attends to the backgrounds of these migrants, the places they have come from, the troubles that drove them across the seas, focusing instead on their arrival and assimilation, their struggle for acceptance as representatives of Australia's largesse during the slow dismantling of white Australia. So what I want to argue strongly for here is that the translation of Australia's vast Asian language archive and Chinese language archive profoundly challenges such an ordering of time and space, a European ordering of time and space. It unstitches a series of national narratives Australians continue to tell about themselves. And these include narratives that are repeated by our politicians who disavow our humanitarian responsibilities to the Asian region, while simultaneously celebrating Australian multiculturalism domestically. So I think by embracing new structures of periodization in Australian history, inclusive of Asia, we can rethink causality in Australian history, revealing overlapping empires, Asian and European, and their reach into Australia, mapping sequential colonialisms and alternative chronologies in Australian history. So here we have a kind of a wonderful photograph of Long Kui. And Long Kui is one of the many Chinese Australians that's interviewed in South Close the Pearl, the book that Ben mentioned earlier. And Richard Horsberg is the son-in-law of Mavis Gokye, who wrote that book, who did all the oral history. And this is Long Kui in his kind of radical student days in Hong Kong. He had really interesting beliefs about society, democracy, equality that were born not just in China, but also in Australia. And if we look at, I think, his life, some of the intellectual currents I'm hinting at emerge in really fascinating and kind of enriching ways. So I think if we take these Chinese Australian lives seriously, if we take these intellectual archives seriously, we might consider, for example, a range of causalities. The Qing Empire's political intervention in colonial Australia and its effects. Many Qing leaders and thinkers came out here and toured this country and advocated on behalf of Chinese Australians, a story that's not told very much. We might think about the reshaping of family life and gender relations in Chinese villages as Australian remittance money flowed in from the goldfields. We might think about the influence of Australian trade unionism on Chinese brotherhood societies from the 1880s and vice versa. We might think about the shaping of Australian communism and anti-communism in response to the 1949 Chinese Revolution. We might think about the insights of the Tiananmen generation into the promises of Australian 1990s neoliberalism and its concurrent disappointments as they fanned out into urban Australia on Hawke-era temporary entry permits, forming a Chinese student precariat in this country, just as China opened to the world. So I teach a number of the kids of Tiananmen migrants. I'm sure we've all kind of met this generation. And a lot of them have incredible archives about their parents' kind of struggles as middle-class people that have become working class in this country and kind of formed a really interesting precariat kind of right at the moment of kind of high Australian neoliberalism. A really fascinating story, I think. So this is the radical challenge of Chinese language sources. And if we're going to kind of meet it, it's going to require moving beyond English language sources, indeed European language sources, in the narration of Australia's past. Julianne Schultz reminds us that without language, stories are lost, knowledge disappears. She speaks about the criminalization of the use of Indigenous languages in this country in the past, requiring immigrants to pass English tests and treating non-English speakers with disdain. They're all parts of what Julianne Schultz calls, quote, scaffolding of silence, a terra nullius of the mind. This is the true cost of English. English is a structural barrier in a white settler nation where so many liberal democratic values, equal opportunity, meritocracy, are aspirational, not real. For what, in truth, is a multicultural nation if it refuses to be a multilingual one? So by way of conclusion, Australian history has been resistant to Chinese perspectives. Here, I have suggested two reasons for this reluctance: the long shadow of Cold War historiography and the influence of the West on the ordering of historical time. There are consequences when we leave Chinese voices out of the national story. We go back in time. The ease with which Cold War era references to Red China have returned to public discourse should disabuse us of the notion that historical time is linear. Rather, to borrow William Sewell's words, historical time is lumpy, uneven, unpredictable, discontinuous, moving backwards and forwards. Cold War threads from 50 years ago picked up with ease in COVID times. Australia is home to one of the oldest civilizations on Earth, but the recognition of this deep time has only recently entered the lexicon of Australian historical practice. The national story is still told along conventional lines: invasion, convict labor, settlement, the gold rushes, federation, war, depression, multiculturalism, globalization. What if we take out these pins, these anchors? Chinese language sources pose a radical challenge to the periodization of Australian history because they place Europeans on the margins of historical action and suggest alternative events as explanations for historical change. It would be a mistake to diminish the importance of Europe to Australian history. Britishness, as Neville Meaney famously argued, is the heart of Australia's democratic inheritance. But I think the Chinese presence in Australia was far more influential than we have come to terms with. New conversations are needed between Chinese language sources and the Indigenous and environmental contexts which bring them to light. If we are to disinter the regional Asian ties which have shaped Australian society in myriad ways since European invasion. To do so requires a fundamental shift in how we narrate historical time, an entwined reckoning with the deep time of the Indigenous past and the imprints left by Chinese peoples, their writings, their visions for the land. Thank you.